Even though academic feedback is ubiquitous in educational settings, and researchers have found evidence that feedback has one of the highest influences on student achievement, little is known about students' memory for the feedback they receive in real classroom settings. The research I will be presenting is aimed at addressing this gap in the literature. In Hattie and Timberley's seminal review of the feedback literature, they outline the four main types of feedback. Task feedback is surface-level, task-specific feedback about whether the student's work is correct or incorrect. This is the most common type of feedback. An example of task feedback is, you need to include X or you did Y correctly. While this type of feedback can allow students to effectively correct their work on the specific assignment at hand, task feedback does not normally generalize to future assignments. Process feedback directs students to general strategies that may be applied to both the current task as well as future tasks. Because process feedback is more generalizable and encourages deeper learning, it is more beneficial than task feedback. An example of process feedback is, you need to edit X by looking for Y, or this would be better if you do Y because. Arguably, the most beneficial type of feedback is self-regulation feedback. This type of feedback instructs students on how to self-assess their work and guides the development of skills necessary to become better self-regulators. An example of self-regulation feedback is, you already know X, check to see if you have done X in this section, or we will be regularly using APA. Check page X of the style manual to see how to reference this type of material for current and future work. Lastly, praise or self-feedback is vague and more focused on the student themselves than the task or their process. An example of self-feedback is, you are a great student, or well done. Praise alone can have ironic consequences for future motivation because it does not encourage students to invest further effort. Thus, it tends to be the least effective at improving academic performance. Using the four types of feedback as our guide, we aim to fill gaps in the literature on students' memory for feedback by exploring the following research questions. Do students have differential recall for the four types of feedback? And if so, is there a relationship between the types of feedback recalled and students' course performance as measured by their final course grade? Because we care about how students are using feedback in real classrooms, we embedded this research in an actual undergraduate applied psychology assignment. The present study is a preliminary investigation of our data, where we examine the findings from the largest laboratory section of the class. Participants were 16 students from across 7 groups in the lab. First, students completed an applied activity on the human body's response to stress. All assignments were graded by teaching assistants before the following lab session. At the beginning of that lab meeting, students were given 10 minutes to individually read through their feedback. 1 week after the feedback read-through, all students were given a surprise-free recall task where they were asked to remember as much of their feedback as possible. The average number of feedback units for each feedback category were calculated at the classroom level for both teaching assistant comments and students' recall. On average, this TA gave task and process feedback most often, and an approximately equal number of feedback units in both categories. Self or praise feedback was given least often. In line with this, task and process feedback were on average recalled most frequently by students. However, they were more than twice as likely to recall task feedback over process feedback, despite being given both types in almost equal measure. While task feedback is indeed beneficial, it is most relevant for improving that particular assignment. So ideally, we want students to remember and use the types of feedback that have the greatest potential to generalize, such as process or self-regulation feedback. Interestingly, when we broke this analysis down by final course grade, we observed that the A students recalled more feedback and more useful types of feedback than their lower scoring peers. But notably, students' recall across all feedback categories was very low compared to the amount of feedback units offered by the TA. Not only were students recalling only a small fraction of their total feedback, but students' recall for the content of the feedback was often poor, with many instances of students transforming the feedback from a more useful type of feedback, such as self-regulation or process, to a simpler form of feedback. For example, when the TA gave a process-based piece of feedback, like, I think this can be significantly condensed if you remove repetition and unneeded details, the student remembered it as a task-based piece of feedback, like long paragraphs. Overall, these findings suggest that students remember only a small amount of their feedback, and what they do remember may not be the most useful formulation for future success. Contrary to what prior research suggests, it may not be that students are intentionally ignoring feedback, but rather they are not remembering or are misremembering it. Practically, these results beg the question, how can we train students to better locate, remember, and use self-regulatory feedback? or at least prevent students from transforming useful process-based feedback into more specific task-based feedback. If we can successfully accomplish these aims, we stand to better prepare students for future learning and improve course performance outcomes.